Dawn lifts over Tonlé Sap, and the water breathes. You feel the hollow tap of a paddle through a skiff's ribs, the faint hush of mangroves holding their breath, the far thunder of a spillway beating like a hidden heart. Mist threads the surface and unthreads again. A fisherman ties a knot by touch. Somewhere behind the trees, stone lips release a measured rush, and the lake answers, rising, falling, keeping time. You taste damp iron in the air. You don't know it yet, but a city of reservoirs and canals is whispering to you, setting your morning by the weight of water. What if a temple state of stone and water quietly ran the sea? Not by planting flags from Bengal to Luzon, but by telling rivers when to turn, telling ships when to move, telling markets what a measure means. Your passport would carry a seal drawn from a baray's geometry. Your coins would ring with a different standard. Even the way you queue would shift, lines broken into lanes like canals, each person moving with the same good sense a floodplain learns after centuries. Maps would look wrong to you at first. Then they would look inevitable. Listen to the spillway. That rhythm is the promise of order. When the lake swells with the monsoon, the channels open. When drought snaps, the gates pinch the flow. The silt settles where it should. And paddies drink enough, but not too much. That's not myth. That's engineering. Laterite blocks, precise gradients, 1,000 small decisions inked into earth until water behaves like law. If you've walked the causeways of Angkor, you've walked the argument. That power can endure when it knows how to hold water. You wake to a world built from that premise. Rice moves along mirrored roads. Couriers change horses at rest houses where rice gruel waits beside crushed ginger and beetle. Old injuries heal in quiet hospitals under Jayavarman's eye. Bridges carry carts toward river mouths where holes sit low with pepper and iron. This is not the story of endless conquest. It's the quieter, heavier thing. Tolls counted by weight, tariffs set by season, pilots licensed by the tide. What if the empire learned the sea the way it learned the lake? A skiff slides past, and you picture a barge gliding down the Mekong with a cargo that would break a road. Pattern interrupt. A single shallow draft rice barge can carry what 50 ox carts haul, with 5 hands and the current as engine. Multiply that by months, multiply that by piece. Now, stamp that calculation onto a beeswax seal, press it into damp parchment at a riverside customs house, and you hear the pop as the seal breaks on delivery in a port you've never seen. Efficiency becomes a sound. You touch your pocket. There is a coin there, heavier than you remember, stamped with the curve of a reservoir wall. Your fingers find a passport stitched for pilots and merchants, a little book that reads more like a charter than a permission slip. It tells you where to anchor in a crosswind, what to pay at a gate, how many palms make a standard beam, which strait will be watched this month because pirates test the slack water. It speaks calmly, like someone who has seen a monsoon and learned not to flinch. You feel a strange relief. Predictability is a mercy we rarely thank. You think of the places that choke the world: Malacca, where 2 seas argue; Sunda, where islands pour the wind into a throat; the mouths of the Mekong, where fresh water finds salt, and the two make a treaty. Imagine a network that reaches all of them without marching an army that far. Imagine a river code carved in stone and copied to palm leaf, ferried down pilings slick with barnacles and up stairways that smell of wet dust. The code does not shout. It counts. It says, this much for pepper, this much for tin, this much to pass at night, this much in a storm. It is the opposite of romance. It is what keeps rice bowls full. You hear the spillway again. A heartbeat. You're not outside it. You're inside it. Your morning coffee would taste different because the price of beans would have been settled under a different sky, in a port where tribute and freight blur, where a pilot recites tariff clauses the way sailors recite stars. Your commute would take a different bridge. Your surname might carry a loanword from a river town that never needed to bend to anyone else's standard. And if you love this feeling of stepping into a timeline that makes your own clearer, subscribe to What If Wars and keep walking with me. Is this fantasy? The gates and canals are real. The lake's flood pulse is measurable. The roads, the rest houses, the hospitals, stones still hold their names. The gap is at sea, where Khmer armies were sure-footed and their ships were not. The question hangs over the water like a bird. Can an empire that mastered floods master straits? You already know the terms if you've ever queued in a crowded room and felt the line flow when someone smart opened a second door. Water law is just that impulse scaled to a civilization. Let the paddle lift. Let the skiff turn. If Angkor stabilizes the floods and learns the lanes between islands, if it buys time with good gates and buys loyalty with good measures, your city wakes to different rules. The seal on your papers carries a reservoir's curve. The toll at your bridge matches the weight in your hand. The map on your wall owes more to sluice gates than to swords. The lake keeps breathing. The heartbeat gets louder. Moonlight slicks the baray walls and turns laterite to graphite. You can see where masons pressed their thumbs into wet mortar centuries ago, the print still holding a shallow crescent. A watchman walks the crest, staff tapping the stones, listening for hollows. Below him, the spillway mouths gleam. The gradient is deliberate, a long breath held and released across a city that measures time in drops. At a rest house down the road, rice gruel steams beside a clay jar of water and a bundle of herbs. A courier slumps, coughs, eats, rises. The network keeps its own pulse. Bridges, way stations, hospitals where crushed leaves cool fever and cracked bones are washed and wrapped. Jayavarman's will is not a shout. It's a road. You touch the edge of a causeway where wheels have bit for ages. The stones slope ever so slightly inward. Rain meets groove. Groove meets culvert. Culvert meets canal. Canal meets reservoir. It reads like a sentence you can walk. The lake writes the opening clause every year. It swells with the monsoon, reverses the river, spills into the paddies until fields become mirrors. Then it withdraws and leaves timing as a gift. Plant too early and seedlings drown. Plant too late and they scorch. The right week is a hinge that swings the granaries open. You don't need an astronomy chart to feel it. You need a farmer's thumb in the mud and a gatekeeper who knows when to lift the board. You watch the gate lift. The mechanism is simple. Stone, wood, rope, weight. The effect is not. A slow rush starts as a purr, becomes a rush, then steadies to something like a promise. Water takes the path laid out for it and leaves silt where hands have asked it to stay. If the silt clogs where it shouldn't, men and women with baskets go waist deep and bring it back to fields that need it. Their work is wet, repetitive, unpictured. It is also why rice grows in rows instead of panic. Pattern interrupt. A family on a low rice barge counts cracked jars one by one, mouths moving, eyes on the line where stain meets clay. 5 cracked out of 20. A decision. Sell at a loss upriver or risk the sea. What do you tax when the river itself moves? You can name the soft power because you can stand in it. Rest houses that promise a bowl and a mat. Hospitals that turn statecraft into care. Bridges that turn a king's face into dry feet in the wet season. Inscriptions that don't threaten. They enumerate distances, donors, duties. Every welfare gesture doubles as logistics. A courier who doesn't collapse gets the message through. A peasant who heals returns to the levee and the levee. The empire's humanitarian hand and its administrative spine are the same arm. But the water that obeys inland finds its own mind at sea. Khmer warriors hold causeways with confidence. Their boats do not hold channels with the same certainty. To the east, Cham pilots smell shoals in the dark. To the south and west, Malay and Javanese captains run hulls with lug sails through throats where 2 oceans argue, sewing planks with fiber that lets a ship flex and survive when a rigid hull splits. In those straits, seamanship is law. No edict can replace a feel for a cross swell. You look down the Chao Phraya corridor and you see the flank. Thai-speaking communities ride wet rice expansion north to south, funneling people and skill into lowlands that take well to irrigation of a different rhythm. Horses and light cavalry sweep where war elephants cannot turn fast. A new capital on a river island builds walls against both flood and spear. Sukhothai rises, then Ayutthaya, confident on a river that offers a back door to markets and tributaries Angkor assumed would flow inward by habit. Their court writes its own calendar of dues. It can skim the trade that Angkor thought it had convinced to stay loyal through roads and rice. A frontier becomes a ledger with items that don't add up. Now, let the monsoon misbehave. Drought cracks embankments from the inside out. Flood shreds them from the outside in. A baray that has not been dredged loses depth with every season until a full pool is only a shallow pan pretending at memory. Silt turns valves into stubborn throats. Channels that should be a brisk walk become knee-deep sludge. Granaries thin, not because the land is poor, but because timing slipped and nobody caught it in time. And when stomachs grow impatient, men who never dreamed of politics start to listen at night. The sound of spilling water is no comfort when it comes at the wrong hour. You imagine a clerk opening the books at a riverside customs house and finding the lines blurred by damp. What was taxed as pepper last year arrives as something labeled mixed cargo, timing off. Quality changed by a storm 3 days ago down at the estuary. The boatmen swear it's the same harvest. The inspector sees shrinkage and seepage and calls it loss. Everyone is right, and no one eats more because of it. If the river's course has shifted a handspan this year, and it can, the sandbar that made an easy ford now takes 3 hours of circling. What do you tax when the ford moves like a thought? You don't need a priest to tell you how thin legitimacy can be. You need a bridge you can trust in the dark. You need a seal that breaks clean, not damp and gummy. You need a dry floor for a bag of seed. The empire knows this. That is why the roads were built. That is why the hospitals were endowed. But the sea asks a question the roads can't answer yet. And a rising river kingdom asks a question the canals can't ignore. The climate adds its own riddle in a language of inches and days. You stand on a causeway under a moon that looks flawless and feel the ground transmit a tremor that is not an earthquake. It is the sum of frictions traveling the network looking for a weak joint. If the joints hold, the road carries news and grain and care. If they fail, the very infrastructure that made the state beloved becomes evidence against it. A broken gate where everyone can point and say, here is where the promise cracked. You look out over the baray and don't see romance. You see a ledger written in water with columns called surplus, drift, loss, repair. The empire's future hinges on whether it can keep those columns balancing while it learns the grammar of the sea and closes the door upriver. You stand in a boathouse that smells of resin and wet fiber and hear the hinge of history swing. The campaigns with Champa end not in ashes but in a bargain. The victors keep walls and provinces, the wiser keep people. Cham shipwrights step across a threshold under garlands, not shackles. Their tools are blessed like guests. Their officers are offered commands with new colors stitched to old pride. You watch a mast laid down on trestles, a keel of light timber curved for the river's temper, ribs sprung and tied, planks stitched and pegged in the lash-lug fashion that forgives a tantrum sea. A sail wide as a field hangs like a wing. The yard flexes instead of breaking. A pilot runs his palm along the grain and nods because the wood knows the wind. Behind the boathouse, the waterworks change, not in grand gestures, but in rhythm. The baray are stepped into terraces like a rice hillside. Gated spillways gain shoulders of stone that bleed sudden floods into calm. Every sixth night, a horn sounds, and dredge crews put their bodies where charts can't go. Torches bead the canals. Silt barges move without wake, poled by men whose legs shine black to the hip. You hear the hush as mud pours, a slow kiss against a field gone lean. The calendar absorbs new marks, dredge weeks, valve inspections, monsoon rehearsals. Technique, not magic. Rope, wedge, lever, habit. A city remembers how to breathe in heavy weather. You sit with scribes who copy a new book by oil light. The water code grows line by line on palm leaf and stone. It is spare and practical because the river punishes poetry. How deep a channel must be kept at sowing, when a gate must open to spare a village downstream, even if a noble's field goes thirsty. Where silt belongs after a breach, the penalties if you cut a weir by night. On the margins, another hand adds conversions, palms to cubits, baskets to caddies, a beam to a span. So weights and measures stop drifting like rumor. A rule is carved, tested, amended, carved deeper. You feel relief you didn't know you were holding. Downriver, customs houses grow ribs. Their floors rise a step against the damp, Their scales hang true and stay true. A new toll appears, not ruinous but tempting in its predictability. Pay 3 parts in silver, 1 in rice, 0 if you carry a royal pilot in monsoon month. The clerk does not haggle. The seal does not sweat. A ship that flies the Angkor pennant passes Malacca with fees cut to a whisper if it stops at designated anchorages, takes on an approved pilot, agrees to share a storm report. What is a navy if the channels themselves swear loyalty? Pattern interrupt. Journey times collapse with a sound you can almost hear. Wood hammer to gong, then silence. The trip from the Mekong mouths to Malacca once took 23 uneasy days in fair season, and twice that when the wind sulked. Now pilots run it in 14 with a stop at a Khmer tide roadstead, and in 12 if they ride the night tide. Tariffs that shaved 8 in 100 at 3 different posts become 3 in 100 at 1, provided seals match and the scale reads clean. A customs officer snaps a beeswax seal onto a bale with the neat click of a latch. A note rides with it. Weight confirmed, dues satisfied, hurricane sighted 2 days east. At the river mouths, new entrepôts bloom like mangroves. Warehouses stand on piles driven through mud that remembers older tides. Merchants from Yunnan lead ponies heavy with tea down the caravan roads and watch their loads become lighter coin. Pepper stacks next to tin, next to raw cotton, next to jars of fermented fish that taste like a homeland even to men who swore they didn't miss it. A clerk reads mixed tongues without losing the line. He points you to a table where the coinage clicks. Silver rides on a standard that spreads because it is easy to live with. Little scalloped pieces buy a bowl. Larger flats close a season. The stamp is a baray curve. The year is a flood mark. The trust sits in your palm. Treaties take the place of sieges where it matters. A princess rides west with a dowry that includes pilots and a promise. Reduce the levy at the strait. An Angkor will shelter your traders in flood years. Send rice when the sky withholds salt. Malay chiefs tie their names to clauses that traders memorize like prayers. A Javanese admiral laughs and then signs because the monsoon cares nothing for pride, and a safe anchorage is a safer throne. Tribute takes the form of exemptions. Obedience becomes choreography. The empire grows in all the places where it does not bruise. The first-order outcomes feel small while you watch them, and then they feel total. Rice surpluses stop wobbling. Granaries breathe without panic. River logistics run on a clock that the clouds respect more often than they used to. Revenue from transit arrives like tide instead of like flood, high, then gone. A standing coastal patrol takes shape, shallow draft holes with Tanya sails and eyes for thieves who love the slack water at dusk. They don't look like an armada, they look like certainty in motion. Markets stop telling stories about next month because next month stops needing stories. You taste the change where taste is most honest. In food that arrives when it should, at a price that makes sense. In a road whose ruts fill on schedule and empty the same way. In a document that reads the same in 3 ports because the measures have stopped arguing. You wonder at how little grandeur it takes to pivot a world. A horn at midnight. A gate that opens on a count of 30. A clerk who refuses a bribe because the scale on his wall would make him a liar. You lift your head and try to catch the exact moment the empire's center of gravity slips from stone into water and from water into law. The question tightens, but it is no longer whether Angkor can touch the sea. It is whether, having touched it, the sea will reach back with recognition. With the Cham at the helm, the code in the ledger, the straits speaking the same tariff gospel, the answer begins to sound like a tide. You ride north with a small column that looks more like an account book than an army. The Chao Phraya corridor narrows under quiet things. A protector's pavilion at the ferry, a way station with a bell, a rest house where the ledgers sleep on clean planks. None of it shouts, it pinches. A caravan arrives, and instead of choosing 100 side paths, it chooses 2, because those 2 carry predictable fees and a guard who knows which bank will be dry if the river lifts by a handspan. Ayutthaya looks downriver and sees fewer levers than it had yesterday. It may bristle, but there are only 2 choices that keep bowls full. Tribute at the season's turn, or a tariff-sharing treaty that lets it skim without bleeding. You can almost hear the corridor click, like a lock finding its tooth. Coins speak across water. the silver standard stamped with a baray curve takes root where trouble hates to linger. At docks loaded at dusk, at stalls that must close fast, at the back room where a buyer's hand is already on the boat rope. Pattern interrupt. A petty market once demanded 4 different weights before a sack of pepper changed hands. Now it uses 1 beam and 2 sets of stones, and the argument ends in a breath. On Bengal's coast, a broker flips a Khmer coin and barely looks. On Luzon, a shopkeeper taps one against his teeth and smiles at the ring. It's not that the coin is beautiful, it's that it refuses to cheat. From Yunnan, the caravans come down in long flickers of dust and bell. Pony hooves shine from river crossings. Tea bricks thud into warehouses raised from rot by good pilings. The scales in the customs hall read the same number week after week because a clerk with a bad eye was moved to a job where numbers can't warp. The caravans learn to love the predictability they use to mock. They stop hedging with bribes and start hedging with calendars. Your ear learns the sound of regularity. It is a door closing at the same hour every day. At court, the air smells of lacquer and sweat and citrus peel. An embassy from the Yuan arrives with the kind of theater that makes soldiers forget to breathe. There are tablets with gold edges. There are ritual bows that test knees. A prince accepts titles that translate to wind and shadow, but the treaty letters say plainer things. Pilotage rights, toll ceilings, the treatment of shipwrecks. Symbolic obedience buys commercial freedom, if you know which way to face and how long to hold your breath. Years later, the Ming inherit the stage, and the choreography tightens. But the script remains clever. Rice when the North Star dims. Silver when mines run thin. Silence when pirates are punished at dawn. You stand behind a screen and hear paper change the direction of ships. Soft power doesn't announce itself. It waits at a doorway. Pilgrim hostels appear along river roads, a bowl of water at the threshold, and a shrine with a flame that never seems to lean. Scholars from river towns win stipends to copy inscriptions and teach measures in markets where fingers used to be the only rulers. Language braids itself without permission. Boatmen borrow Khmer numerals because their loops are obvious under lamp smoke. A scribe in Quanzhou copies a tariff clause word for word and adds a gloss in his own hand for sluice day, a term that didn't exist for him last year. You feel the cables tightening between places that once ignored each other and now share a weather of law. Everyday life changes with a patience that feels like mercy. Fishermen time their nets to gate openings, because the spill pulls fish like a low drum calls dancers. Pattern interrupt. On sluice nights, a catch rises by a third, not by miracle but by habit aligned to a schedule. A mother stacks bowls by the door and knows how many to wash because the ferry's timing stopped lying. A mason buys tendon salve with a coin that doesn't need explanation. A pilot keeps a folded palm leaf under his sash with the tariff table stitched into his memory and recites aloud at dawn just to steady his breath. Friction doesn't vanish. It becomes precise. Pirates learn to counterfeit seals and are hauled into a court that cares more about the weight of the wax than the weight of their names. A border lord tries to skim 1 part in 100 and is met by an audit squad with callous shoulders and a habit of counting in public. A monsoon fails, and the code's mercy clause opens gates upstream at the cost of a noble's vanity. You sense new corners appear in the map, where anything that hides will be seen when the sun reaches there, which it always does in time. Ayutthaya tests the lock and finds its teeth too well cut to break. It offers a prince for a princess and a promise for a percentage and calls the pride. On bad years, tribute shipments look like help. On good years, treaty convoys feel like victory parades. The language of dominance shifts from drums to receipts. You taste the strangeness of a world that expands by closing gaps. No garrisons on far coasts, no glorious burnings, just rules that catch and keep catching until the straits sound like streets and the rivers like laws read aloud. You walk to the water and listen. The spillways' thrum is still a heartbeat, but now you can tell it has learned a second rhythm. The far pulse of tides hitting stone and answering back in coin, in measure, in treaty. The web holds, the map looks inevitable, the queue gathers before dawn at the river gate. You stand with pilots and porters, the air salted and cool, a line of hulls nudging the pilings like animals waiting to be named. A clerk warms his hands over a brazier. The bell on the way station hangs still. You open a little book whose cover feels oiled and durable, stitched tight at the spine, the thread dark with touch. Your passport is not an ornament. It is a map that breathes. Inside, the pages carry anchor sketches, wind notes, a table of dues that trims fear off the price of distance. One stamp shows a roadstead off Malacca, a crescent of safe water flanked by a reef that would eat you alive if you guessed wrong. Another stamp is a curve that you recognize now without thinking, the shoulder of a reservoir wall that turns panic into flow. A customs officer lifts a wax pellet and warms it against the brazier until it smells faintly of honey. He sets a die into it and brings a firm hand down. The seal takes the impression with a clean bite and a gloss that means it will not crumble by evening. He writes a number that will match the number in a port you have never seen. He does not smile, and he does not threaten, and you realize how rare and valuable it is to meet a man whose authority lives in the reliability of his tools. Your fingers find a coin and roll it back and forth. It is not delicate. It has a thickness that forgives rough palms and wet counting. The stamp is the baray curve again, the year a flood mark you could verify with your own eyes if you walked upriver to the reference stone. Pattern interrupt. A counterfeiter tried to pass a thinner coin in a market where ears knew the ring. It thudded instead of sang, and 10 heads turned at once. No chase, no blades, just sound doing the work of law. The gate opens on schedule, and the water answers. Nets go out in a practiced arc. The ferry kneels to take the first 15 people and rises patient as the next 15 step forward. Your place in the line was decided 10 breaths ago, by a rule carved on a wall where moss refuses to grow. You don't feel managed. You feel the opposite of managed. You feel released into a current somebody maintained while you slept. A voice near you reads from memory in the slow cadence of a prayer. It is a fragment from the water code, a clause that requires opening a gate upstream to save 3 villages downstream, even if it drowns an orchard that belongs to a house with a name. The voice does not rise for the cost. It sets the cost down next to the benefit like 2 bowls on a mat. You know where the money comes from to pay for dredging in the dry season, a fraction of every toll and a portion of a special levy that spares widows and apprentices in their first year of work. You know where the muscle comes from. Some corvée shifts, yes, but more wages than rumor admits, counted aloud at dusk when the silt settles and shoulders shake. Somebody always pays. The question is whether the payer can still stand in the morning. In the slip between boats, you taste brine and fish oil and the little electric note of fear that never quite leaves men who trust water for their living. The code makes fear measurable. It schedules the season when pirates are most likely to try the slack water at dusk and puts 2 patrol sails in the channel on those nights, not every night. It lists the penalties for cutting a weir by lantern light and the mercy for a man who breaks a levee to let a friend's house breathe. Law with edges, but also joints. You think of how often power becomes an appetite. Here, at least for this moment, power presents itself as maintenance. The dredge crews know the other side of this mercy. Their lungs fill with the smell of mud and algae. Their knees carry the city's arithmetic. One breaks a rib when a basket slips and is carried to a hospital whose endowment was written into a treaty clause so gracefully that men who signed it believed they were only buying pilotage. A stone column near the canal mouth lists names. The inscription is not as tall as a temple gate. It doesn't need to be. Children throw dried flowers in the water there on sluice nights and then race to watch fish flicker like a storm of knives. Their rhyme has numbers in it now. They learned to count in a market where counting stopped being a test and became a habit. You close the passport and it feels heavier than it should for its size. It has a life inside it, wind seasons, tariff holidays, a stamp that proves a harbor owes you shelter and weather, a note that says scales must be calibrated at new moon. You imagine it passing from your hands to your child's hands, without the sick joke of new rules every year. You imagine a low table where the book lies near a bowl of fried riverweed, and your family talks about next month's plan with no one looking over a shoulder for a message that might change everything by dawn. Stability is not glamorous. It tastes like rice that arrives when it should. You look at the silver coin again and consider who profits. Pilots, obviously. Porters whose knees will last longer because they carry predictability, not panic. Princes who sign treaties that feel like victories because they can parade them. Scribes whose skills become a bridge between tongues. Who bends? Noble houses with orchards where a mercy clause floods on schedule every 5th year. Petty lords with hands in the toll jar. Ship captains who loved haggling more than navigating. Who breaks? Some will, loudly. A counterfeit ring. A port official who believed he was the law. You hear the quiet applause of the river when such men discover they were only weather. Your morning folds around this question like a river around a bend. What else could have been rescued by rules that measured what mattered and ignored what didn't? A calendar built on flood and scar. A coin that could be trusted by feel. A passport that told a frightened pilot where to aim in crosswind. You are not holding romance. You are holding the shape of a choice a city made about itself and kept making while the stones darkened and lightened with centuries of rain. If this walk through an alternate dawn sharpened your own, subscribe to What If Wars and keep a space on your map for the roads that never needed armies. When you pour water today into a cup, a sink, a field, ask yourself the only question an empire like this wants you to keep asking. Which hidden gate in your life decides the price of your day?